Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this instructional course on understanding pediatric eye exam and strabismus. It's a basic intermediate course that will take you through understanding and managing broad, in broad guidelines, most of the strabismus and children you're going to see. Unfortunately, we will not have the expertise of Professor Pradeep Sharma because he is involved in some other session, though he was supposed to be here. So I would just be a pale shadow, but take his place and we'll discuss concomitant strabismus with him. So we'll of course start with Dr. Digvijay, who is has his own independent practice in Gurgaon, an outstanding pediatric ophthalmology and strabismologist, followed by Dr. Swati, who's there with me at RP Center, who will be talking on amblyopia. Just a little bit of rearrange, I will be talking about surgical planning in broad terms, followed by Dr. Suma, who will be talking about approach to esotropia. Dr. Suma heads the pediatric ophthalmology and strabismus at Shroff Charity Eye Center in Delhi. That will be followed by intermittent exotropia, Dr. Ankur Sinha, who runs a pediatric ophthalmology glaucoma service at Jaipur, an extremely proficient and outstanding surgeon. And then I will complete with incompetent strabismus and nystagmus. Any questions, we'll hope to take it in the middle. So I'll stop share now, and we'll have Dr. Digvijay Singh, who will be talking about how to examine a child.
So is my screen visible?
Yes, Digvijay, please.
All right, sir. So thank you, Professor Rohit, for having me as a part of your instruction course. And I'm the opening batsman. I'll start with talking about the effective eye exam in children. And that's probably the first step in the effective refraction in children. That's the first step towards managing any such pediatric ophthalmic problem. And some of the tips and tricks. I'm going to focus mostly on the tips and tricks specific from the pediatric perspective, but just a couple of slides on the history first. So it's important that the informant here, the child himself cannot tell much. So the informant has to be a parent. So usually it's important to ask the mother or the caretaker. So a lot of times the parents may be working, they're at office, or the child's with the caretaker or in the daycare. You could ask the caretaker as well about the history of the child or the history of what's happening to the child. So the informant is very important, because if you have an unreliable history, then the whole process doesn't make any sense after that. Then about the complaints, again, from the complaints perspective, the complaints are often incomplete. The child will not tell. Parents may know some part of it. You can ask direct questions here to lead the parents and ask the child in a friendly manner as well. And a lot of times he will respond. The duration of the complaints, it's more often noticed at a later age. It may be there for a longer period. So that's again something for you to take notice of. Family history is important. Look at other siblings. If they've come, you can examine them. Ask the parents to bring the siblings in the next session if required. In terms of treatment history, the actual person who's providing the treatment should be the one who should be asked the treatment history, as well as, because here, the eye drops, whether they're being put or not being put, that's important. Has the child compliant with these patches? So remember, a good history is a very, very important thing before we move on to the examination. In examination, the assessment of vision, and I think for the entire pediatric examination, the first tip probably, and the first tip and the first trick, and probably what works most, is patience. You have to have patience. You have to give the child time to cooperate, to respond. You have to make a rapport with the child. You have to become a friend with the child and give him time. And that's how it works. A lot of times children come, whose vision was less at another center, and they come and we give them enough time and they can read the entire chart, and we realize that they were quite okay. So give them time. You can use other forms of checking the visual acuity, such as using occlusion to see whether he resists occlusion to the better seeing eye. You could use stellar or acuity cards, Cardiff acuity cards, and things like candies or certain small bribes can help the child tell you the vision assessment. From a refraction perspective, it's a very important thing in a pediatric situation. Obviously, the whole talk of refraction would be, it'll take a long time. So I'm just giving the predominant tips and tricks that's important here. But remember, again, patience is very, very important. The gold standard is a retinoscopy, a good retinoscopy done under appropriate cycloplegia, which could be atropine for children less than 5 years of age, or with children having esotropias. And you can have hometropine for older children, but you must do a cycloplegic refraction. Cyclopentolate can also be used if you don't want the child to come back, or the child cannot come back for a second visit. You can use alternative means such as an auto, like the Retinomax you see here, which is a portable AR. We often use, if you look down at my clinics is the plus optics that we often use here. It's a photorefractor, gives us a screening value of children, and retinoscopy done with a child in the mother's lap or the parent's lap when he's most comfortable is very, very important. Now, for examining the head posture, you should do it when the child is not aware. So if the child becomes conscious, he's going to correct his head posture, or the parents will often correct the head posture that looks straight. But when they're not conscious, not aware that you're examining them, that's when you should see when they're walking into the room. And it's important for you to make a note of this. Similarly, for the face turn, that's again a very, very important thing. And also, while talking to the child, generally you should keep observing this, because it may change a little bit as he gets, his thoughts are diverted towards your talk. Now, for ocular alignments, very often when you look at a child, you can get a sense of whether the eyes seem aligned or not aligned, but you could do the Bruckner's reflex from a distance for a small kid, and they're very cooperative for this because you're not approaching them directly, so they don't feel threatened. You could look at the corneal reflection tests as well, and for older children, you can do a prism bar cover test once they're cooperative, and at least try it on the first visit, and then you can do it on the second visit, because now the child realizes it's nothing that's going to trouble me or threaten me. To look for the cataract of the lens, a distant direct again works very well. Older children can be pursued to come onto the slit lamp, but you can use a portable slit lamp, you can use certain portable devices. And then, of course, for very small children, you need to do an examination under anesthesia when you want to look at the IOP, the cataract, the axial length, and other things. So again, that works. So the lenticular examination is again something that's relatively easy to do if you have a system or a process in how to do it. For the fundus evaluation, an indirect ophthalmoscopy works very well, or I sometimes use a portable fundus camera, as you can see in the picture on the bottom here. That's a non-mydriatic, so you don't have to dilate the child, and the child for 1 sec gets you a good image. You can have a look at it. But mostly when the lighting is very high, they're not happy, so you need to do a low illumination on the indirect when you're going to look at the fundus for them. Of course, an examination under anesthesia can be used here. And you have, and the eye drops for very small children need to be specially prepared and diluted. That is very, very important. Now, intraocular pressure is something that you don't necessarily have to measure in every child. So you need to know that, do you really need to measure it? Because a lot of cases in the very small children, the telltale signs from the changes in the cornea and the eyeball itself can tell you whether the intraocular pressure is high or not. But if needed, then you can use devices such as the eye-care or rebound tonometer. You can use a tonopen, you can use the Perkins tonometer, even a Schiotz would do. And an examination under anesthesia has to be performed for the very small children. And you should know the variation in IOP that could happen because of anesthesia. Stereo acuity, again, something from a strabismus perspective I'm adding here. In children, a simple Lanz 2 pencil test can tell you whether he's having binocularity or not. You could use an NFT2. I often use that in my clinic, which is a Frisbee-Davis distance chart. You have actual objects moving. It's real depth stereo acuity, and children think of it as a game, and they can tell you. And then you have these other tests that are available, such as the Lange test. The Randor test, they may or may not be able to wear the Polaroid glasses, particularly the smaller children. And even in the smaller size glasses, they're sometimes not able to tell. So you could use the TNO or the Randor as well, but you need to interpret it with a pinch of salt. So that, in brief, kind of in a nutshell, are the few tips and tricks that I've over time had for a pediatric eye examination. I hope they help you out.
Thank you, Dr. Digvijay. If you have a child or a parent who's very resistant to willing to get refracted, any specific tricks you would advise that would help us to, get that child to, be willing to get refracted?
So
you mentioned a couple of them, mother's lap, but other than that, you have a child who's extremely scared of you, who's been poked, come back from vaccination some time back, so he's very scared of you as a doctor. So how would you, what would be few things we want to get him refracted for?
So I think the first thing we do is that we sometimes don't necessarily, dilate them on the first visit. We kind of get so we do. So I use a photo refractor, like a plus optics device here, to kind of show to the parents that, there is a problem here, that there seems to be a high cylinder, there seems to be something. So we must refract the child, but we don't necessarily dilate on the first visit. We try and develop a rapport with the child. The first visit could just be a cursory examination, just a hello, hi. We have some, funny looking stickers on the walls, and the kids feel comfortable. And then usually in the second visit, or we tell them to dilate from home and come. So either of the two can help. But if the child is still very resistant and, he's still very anxious, then sometimes, you just have to hold them down and do it. But that's really the last resort.
So I think key points Dr. Digvijay highlighted. One, that even I never do a refraction if possible on the first visit. The child should not have any unpleasant experience in our first visit together. And whenever possible, that's why the next visit is for refraction, whenever possible, whether it's even for fundus exam, I would also ask the kids to get dilated at home. So the unpleasant experience of drops is with the parents at home and not associated with us. And yes, and the talk about the mother's lap, sometimes in very small children, you can even have the mother hold the child like she would on her shoulders, and you can do it over the mother's shoulder. So those are a few things which can help us have a slightly dim room so that you get the reflexes very quickly. And of course, you could consider using the autorefractometers, the autorefractors Dr. Digvijay talked about. So great. So that's the first key step, a basic examination, and an extremely important component is age appropriate cycloplegic refraction. Maybe we'll discuss the cycloplegic agents in a bit. Let's go on to the next, the key issue that we must handle, that is picking up and managing amblyopia. And these are very exciting times for amblyopia, because after a very long time, we have a lot of interest in amblyopia management, and very interesting new devices and opportunities are now available as an option. So Dr. Swati, faculty at the RP Center, would be telling us something about how to manage children with amblyopia.
Are my slides visible?
Yes, Dr. Swati, if you could make them full screen.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the opportunity. I would be talking about amblyopia, and as we all know, amblyopia is either unilateral or bilateral decrease of vision, where you have partial visual deprivation or abnormal binocular interaction. So it can be, no cause can be detected by the examination, and is reversible if treated on time. It can be classified as strabismic amblyopia, and it's more commonly seen with esotropia as compared to exotropia because of the overlap of the two fields of two eyes. Then there is ametropic amblyopia, where bilaterally the high significant refractive errors are present, which causes formation of blurred vision and thus leads to amblyopia. In anisometropic amblyopia, basically there has to be a difference of two line difference in two eyes to call it as an amblyopia, and it's more common with anisohypermetropia as compared to anisomyopia, and it's a binocular interaction, abnormal interaction between the two eyes that leads to amblyopia. The most difficult amblyopia to treat is a visual deprivation amblyopia that is seen with the congenital corneal opacities, cataracts, or any other media opacity. So management of amblyopia, the key is to identify it early, evaluate the cause of the amblyopia, and treat it at the proper time, at the time duration of cortical plasty. That depends on number of factors like age of the patient, duration of the low vision, the amount of the refractive error, and type of amblyopia, the compliance of the patient. So as I said, the key is to identify the cause of vision loss and treat it before we actually move on to amblyopia therapy. Then correct the adequately for refractive error, which is very, very important, that to do a proper refraction under cycloplegia, under the proper age appropriate cycloplegia. And after we have corrected the refractive error, we need to give some time to eye to get stimulated, so that the vision is formed properly, and then give an preferential stimulation of the amblyopic eye. So you have to preferentially stimulate the amblyopic eye and kind of suppress the stimulation in the better eye. So earlier the goal was to achieve the equal vision, but now the goal is to achieve the binocular vision stereopsis. So our goals have changed. Therefore, the therapy, the management of amblyopia has also evolved with it. So what was initially up to the optical correction, occlusion therapy, penalization, and other stuff has now coming, the active vision therapy is now coming up in big way in management of amblyopia therapy. I'll be showing how we can do active vision therapy with help of the different apps that are coming nowadays. So still the optical correction, as I said, can never be overemphasized. The proper cycloplegic refraction, proper prescription of glasses can never be overemphasized. And that's the first step for the management of amblyopia. So these are the current guidelines which were published in IGO last year, how and when we should prescribe the optical corrections for this patient. You need not correct the small amount of refractive error for all patients. It has to be under the, it has to be, there are guidelines according to which you need to give them corrections. They are different from myopias, hypermetropias, and different from isometropias and anisometropia. So, as I said, occlusion therapy still remains the gold standard for the treatment of amblyopia, but we are kind of moving to partial part-time occlusion rather than full-time occlusion, and various pedic studies have shown that the part-time occlusion is as good as full-time occlusion in mild to moderate case of amblyopia. For severe amblyopia, we may still have to go for full-time occlusion therapy. So the maintenance of occlusion therapy is equally important as starting it, and we need not stop it abruptly because that may lead to the recurrence of amblyopia. You have to taper it gradually in terms of duration of occlusion. So in case you start with say full-time occlusion, you may taper to 6 hours, then followed by taper to 4 hours, and you can follow the patient every 2 months to look at if there is visual improvement or not. If the vision becomes stable, then we can think of tapering the occlusion therapy. Penalization is still considered an option where the patients are not very compliant with occlusion and is useful only for mild to moderate degree of amblyopia. It may not work in severe degree of amblyopia. Pharmacotherapy has also been tried in these cases, in cases which have not responded to regular occlusion therapy, and some kind of vision stabilization has been seen in these cases. Active vision therapy is coming up in big way in the management of amblyopia in form of video games, because they not only kind of develop interest in the patient, they are they also cause active involvement of cytokinin and dopamine pathway, and that's kind of stimulus the cortex. So we have monocular video games, we have dichoptic video games, and we have video games that may help in generation of stereo acuity. So this was a study conducted at our center where we found that the patients who was on treatment with occlusion as well as video game showed more improvement as compared to the patients who had only occlusion as a therapy. The role of dichoptics is also coming in big way, because the major advantage of dichoptics is that both eyes are stimulated at the same time. So the amount of binocular interaction that is possible with the dichoptic therapy is not possible with the monocular therapy. And that's one reason why it is now preferred more for the amblyopia management as compared to monocular therapy. It may be given as a standalone therapy in mild cases, and or could be combined with occlusion therapy as well. So this was one study conducted at a center where 30 children were asked to play this Tetris stereo block game. And in this case, the better eye was suppressed and had lesser contrast as compared to the amblyopic eye, which had more contrast. So that's a way of suppression of stimulus in the better eye. And they were asked to play this game 7 days a week for 3 months. Another 30 children, the other group, received part-time occlusion without any video game. So at the end of the study, we found that the best corrected visual acuity was more or less equal in both the eyes, both for distance and near, both for the final outcome. However, the near stereo acuity was better in the game group as compared to the occlusion group. The contrast was also better in the game group as compared to the occlusion group. However, the older children who were more than 10 years of age were more fond of the game rather than the patching therapy, while younger children were more compliant with the patching therapy as compared to the games. So to conclude that amblyopia, the first step is to rule out if there is any cause of the amblyopia and treat it. Then proper cycloplegic refraction and proper adequate optical correction is must. They have to be regularly followed up, and the reassessment has to be done at each follow-up, and compliance has to be ensured. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Swati. Thank you very much for a comprehensive evaluation of amblyopia options that we have available. As I said, we'll just change the order a bit. I will go next on surgical planning, and then we will go on to the specific diseases. So we'll start with comitant esotropias, and then we'll have a discussion on incomitant, and finally nystagmus. So I'll just start my screen share, and I'll be talking about surgical planning in strabismus. I do not have any financial interest to disclose, although we are always looking out for some. And before we start our surgical planning, some of the tips we've already discussed, but it always helps to be a little sharper in our pre-surgical workup. So I'll just highlight some of the key things. Accommodative esotropia is something that will be discussed subsequently as we talk about esotropias, but always remember, just a refraction can change the entire management, and age appropriate cycloplegic refraction is essential. And in many cases, in young children, the esotropia may just get corrected with glasses and there would be no need for surgery. Divergent squints, if you thought that may not really make a difference, refraction would not make a difference, it's important to note that fusion in a divergent squint or even in exophorias is the key responsible feature that helps us to control strabismus. And that is essentially possible only if we give high quality images on the retina. So a good refraction, increasing the quality of vision, will help to control the fusion and help to control the exotropia. So intermittent divergent squints may become an exophoric if you give them appropriate glasses. We've talked about evaluation and managing amblyopia, and it is extremely essential that we manage amblyopia before we operate. There are too many advantages for this. Firstly, you are wasting time that could be essential for amblyopia therapy. If you start amblyopia therapy after surgical correction, especially patching, there is a possibility that what you converted tropia into aphoria may redevelop. So you may have a recurrence of the squint, as well as parents and children do not feel that there is any actually problem with the eye because they don't keep checking the Snellens at home. So they may actually lose interest and stop coming back to you. We know that children are far more intelligent than us, and they find excellent ways to evade any therapy we may give. So it's always important to interact and to discuss the possible treatment with the parents and the children. A lot of other lesions can present as strabismus. We've had possible children presenting us with early onset strabismus, which we thought was infantile in origin, but it landed up being an acquired cause. So it's always important to definitely rule out an acquired strabismus. And if there is even a little bit of suspicion, work up towards that. Again, variability is something in an older patient, recent onset, variability can be imminently possible. And myasthenia, being the great mimicker that is, could present with any kind of strabismus. Always be sure of your diagnosis because you don't want to operate something thinking that it is something else. Duans and sixth nerves are often missed or interchanged, and it's very important to identify a Duans because you would not want to do large lateral rectus resections for the esotropia that is there. So it's very important to pick up Duans as a possible differential of sixth nerves. Again, pseudo-esotropia. The parents may feel that there is an esotropia, but look at the corneal light reflexes. From afar, the child may look esotropic because of the adnexal positions, but the moment you shine the light, you'll realize the corneal light reflexes are centered. Ask the parents to take photographs at home, repeatedly using a flash so that you can look at it. And of course, it's very important to follow up these child because nothing precludes a child with pseudo-esotropia to subsequently develop a true strabismus. The factors that affect our amount of surgery we are planning is the angle kappa. So it's important to have an idea of the angle kappa. Look at the eye when it's at a distance target and look for pseudo deviations that may be there. So the distance deviation, either eye or apparent deviation, is important. Look at the adnexal relationships, epicanthal folds, hypertelorism. Inform the parents that this is not something that will be corrected, and there may be for some time an apparent squint which will get corrected as the child grows. Look at the eye movements, both versions and ductions, and look for limitations because they need to be managed before you intervene. So FDT has to be done both pre and intra-op. And finally, what is your sensory state you're looking at? It's cosmetic, functional, you want to overcorrect and manage oblique overactions. Graded weakening procedures of the recti are recessions with their various modifications like hangback, adjustable, slanting recessions. Other than that, for recti, there is not too much of an option. You would not, Farden is a procedure, a weakening procedure that weakens the muscle in the direction of action, but otherwise free tenotomies, myectomies are only described for obliques, and even there we would prefer to do a graded procedure as compared to a free procedure. There are upper limits for both recession and resection. Going beyond a particular amount would weaken the muscle and would cause gross movement underactions, limitation of movement, which would be extremely difficult to manage post-op, and the patient may complain of diplopia and horizontal gazes. Large recession resections can actually cause palpable fissure changes that make it uncomfortable for the patient. Again, for the recti, graded resections or now plications are the procedure of choice for strengthening procedures. Advancement is possible in a previously recessed muscle, and tucking double pressing is possible for superior oblique. Transposition procedures are planned if there is a very poor muscle action in any of the muscles. Again, maximum resection is limits for maximum resection for every muscle is there, because the moment you start cutting beyond a particular amount, you start cutting myofibrils, which will actually add to the weakening process rather than strengthening it anymore. There are described gross nomograms for primary surgery. Use them in your initial decision making, but over time, because of the variation in the way you operate, you may have a little difference in the outcomes, and you must alter your surgery according to your differences. There is a lot of options between bilateral recession and unilateral recess resect. The advantages of a recess resect procedure is that you get an added effect of almost 25% in a one eye surgery, which is not possible in a bilateral recession. However, a bilateral recession, of course, causes less inflammation, less edema. The eyes look similar on both sides. Therefore, the palpable fissure changes are not so much as there is for a unilateral recess resect procedure. So in an adult where it's difficult to block both eyes, we prefer a recess resect versus under GA, which is a bilateral procedure preferred. We know that recessions are stronger than resections, and we get a larger response in the medial rectus compared to the lateral rectus. We get 25% more effect if we operate one eye, and much greater impacts on infants. Like I said, do not induce concomitants. You can divide the surgery between the two eyes. Be consistent in what you do. Factors that affect outcomes include age, patient response, and larger deviations create a much larger response. So the amount of surgery the change in the amount of surgery should be graded accordingly. Placement of sutures, the amount of muscle exposure, dissection, all these are surgeon factors. So it's very important to be consistent in whatever way you do, where you hold the muscle, where you start the measurements from, and where you pass the sutures, because they make a difference. There is no significant difference in outcome in both limbal and fornix incision for the same amount of surgery, and it is a surgeon preference, although fornix incisions are faster, cleaner, and cause less early problems, but limbal incisions are equally good and probably better for beginners. So our decision is also affected by what we are operating and our endpoints, and that will be discussed in the concomitant surgery we're talking about. You must measure ANV patterns because it's important to incorporate that and operate for the obliques if obliques are overacting. And if obliques are not overacting, you need to shift the muscles and correct for the ANV patterns in your primary surgery itself. So the important take back thoughts are: nothing can alternate a good workup, correct diagnosis, and realistic expectations. And you need to be very clear and confident in what you do and discuss everything with your patient all the time. Thank you. And I'll stop my screen share. We will now go on to Dr. Suma, who would be talking to us about managing infantile esotropia, managing esotropias, case of esotropias, where we would discuss all kinds of esotropias. Dr. Suma, who is the director of pediatric ophthalmology in strabismus and has been working there for a long time, strengthening the services there, which are now top world class. Dr. Suma, please.
Ma'am, you are muted. Dr. Suma, you are muted, please. Dr. Suma.
Yeah, they are muted. Yeah. They unmuted me. Yeah, they are. Thank you, Rohit, for the kind words. And I would like to thank you again for giving me this opportunity to speak on one of my favorite topics, which is ESO deviations, because I find them easy to treat and giving you nice results. So it is classified as Von Nuden has classified concomitant ESO deviations into accommodative esotropias and non-accommodative esotropias, and also then other varieties of sensory esotropia, microtropia, and nystagmus blockade syndrome. not moving forward.
Just restart, reload your presentation. Sometimes it does that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And concomitant ESO deviations are paralytic and restrictive. I think we have a presentation on that. So a child presenting with esotropia, you have to know the age of onset, whether it is intermittent or constant, more when it is focusing for near. And it is important for us to do an atropine ointment refraction for children below the age of 6 years. I still do an atropine refraction, but I feel you get the full degree of hypermetropia, and then you are sure whether you have corrected the full accommodative part of the esotropia. And after 6 years, maybe you could do the cyclopentolate CTC. What we say is that which is performed after 60 minutes, which we do the retinoscopy after 60 minutes. So this is a young boy who presented with inward deviation of left eye, and his vision was right eye 6/9 and 6/18. Unaided vision 30 prism adapters, both for distance and near. When we did a cycloplegic refraction, we found that it was 4 and 5, and then we gave a full cycloplegic refraction. Visited his vision after 2 months and gave the amblyopia treatment because his vision in the left eye was poor. So this is a case of fully refractive accommodative esotropia. The natural course is you can reduce the power, you can wean off after age of 8 years. I wait for 8 years till the binocular sensory vision development is complete. Lower levels of hyperopia, we find that they are associated with higher success rates. And any single reduction you do after the age of 8 years is around 0.75 or 1. And most of these children develop good binocular potential. So when your deviation is not fully corrected with glasses, then you check whether it is equal for distance and near. If not equal, if it is more for near, then you measure the AC by A ratio and the NPA. If it is equal for distance and near, then we know it is a case of partially accommodative esotropia. Simple instrument to use to measure NPA is the RAF rule, and the interpretation is a blurred point. It tells you the amount of accommodation that the eyes can exert, and then you measure the amount of NPA. And you also measure the amount of ACA ratio, because this is very important for us to know whether we need to give bifocals or whether we need to go ahead for a surgery. So this is how we measure with the gradient method, deviation with the lens minus the original deviation and divided by the power of the lens, which gives us the ratio. So if it is more than 5, we know it is a high AC ratio. And those cases where here you can see that ortho for distance with glasses, for near the child as ESO, then you can correct it with the bifocal add and you get the squint corrected with the glasses. Now, partially accommodative, you will have a squint which is present even with the glasses. In those cases, we need to operate the non-accommodative part. We either do a unilateral or a bilateral medial rectus recession depending on the amount of ESO deviation. Special care to tell parents that they need the glasses even after surgery. Now, the other one is the non-accommodative convergence excess, which has a normal AC by ratio with a difference in the distance and near. Those cases, we need to do either you do a large recession of the medial rectus measuring for near, or you do a Farden surgery. So the Farden surgery where you put the non-absorbable suture 12 to 13 millimeter from the insertion with a non-absorbable suture, and then you place it on the sclera and you fix the muscle to the globe. Now, if you have to combine it with recession, then you can do a Farden with a recession. So infantile esotropia is another non-accommodative esotropia present since birth and 6 months. And they have a large angle deviation, small refractive error, a cross fixation is present. If there's an abduction deficit, important to do the doll's head maneuver to rule out a 6 nerve palsy or Duane's. We need to do an atropine refraction corrective more than 2. Patch for the amblyopia, like if an infantile. Then if there's a fixation preference, patch the dominant eye for 4 to 6 hours or 4 hours in a day, and then see for the squint alternating and then plan surgery. Early surgery is required because it gives you good sensory outcomes. So early surgery could be ultra by 6 months, which may not occur in our scenario, but early is before the age of 2 years. So you measure it from the limbus. So as early when you operate it, like when you do not measure. So this is how the measurement has been done. So in a nystagmus blockage, where there is nystagmus which is dampened by convergence, they have a large variable deviations. The primary defect is supposed to be in the brainstem. You do either a Farden surgery or large recession of the medial rectus. Now another entity which is an acute acquired concomitant esotropia, AACE. which is also another infrequent presentation. It presents with sudden onset of diplopia and comitant esotropia, which in eye children whose eyes may have been straight. So it is classified as type 1, Swan type, after artificial interruption of fusion, or the Burian-Franceschetti type, not associated any refractive error, or the Belchowski type, which is associated with myopia in young myopic adults, or you can have acute esotropia of neurological origin. So in this, an all acute comitant esotropia, it is essential that we do a MRI to rule out if there is no other neurological problems. So in this case, where the MRI was normal, went ahead and did a both eyes medial rectus recession. Another child who presented with binocular diplopia, blurring of vision, and with psychological problems. She had a 636 vision for distance and for near N90, N24. Large variable alternating esotropia, did a retinoscopy, was going up to -4 to -5, did a dynamic retinoscopy, showed a lead of -4. Given did an atropine refraction, found that she had no minus refractive error, did an MRI, was normal, and then we ruled out this was a case of accommodative excess spasm, where we then treated the patient with atropine for twice a day for a month, gave her bifocals, and then tapered after 2 months. We found that even with the atropine, she still had intermittent esotropia, so gave her Fresnel prisms and started her on Burgins exercises, did the lens rack exercises with the positive lenses, waited till she was coming up to +2, she could relax, and then tapered off slowly the atropine. Did also a flipper lenses and with a +2 and a -2, and at the end of nearly 3 months, she became esophoric and ortho for distance. And then we slowly weaned off a bifocal and a prisms. So the paralytic types, I think the incomitant is being covered, but there are 2 types of esotropia which is incomitant for like a 6 nerve palsy and a esoduan. So these are 2 esotropias where we need to, one is a restrictive palsy and one is a restrictive strabismus and one is a paralytic strabismus. So in this, whether the FDT is positive or negative, you decide on whether you want to do a superior rectus transposition in a case of Duans. If there is severe globe retraction and no upshoot, there is upshoot and downshoot, you would prefer to just do a medial rectus recession. You would avoid doing superior rectus transposition in such cases. So I have covered most of the esotropias. Thank you for the kind attention.
Thank you, Dr. Suma, for a very nice comprehensive coverage of esotropias in a very, very short time. Just a couple of questions before we move on to the next talk. Would you operate any form of accommodative esotropia? I mean, of course, partially accommodative we would, but in any other form, would you plan any surgery?
No, I would not plan a surgery. I would not plan a surgery in an accommodative esotropia. A squint
even
surgery.
If the patient is squint surgery. Even if the patient is extremely insistent.
I counsel them. I keep counseling them. I know that I have had cases where they have got surgery done outside for the LASIK also. They have operated some have operated children with LASIK for the accommodative esotropia plus number, and they have landed back. And I had to again operate for the strabismus. So I would not advise anybody to operate on a child, especially a child with accommodative esotropia. We can wean off the glasses, and most of the children get weaned off very soon, like by 12 to 13 years of age. If they are a low hyperope, you can wean them off.
I think that's the key point that we must always insist, that any accommodative component of the esotropia should be managed with refractive correction. And it's always important to emphasize that to the patient and inform them that over time, as the hyperopia decreases, there would be a tendency, if we operate now, for the eye to actually go into an exotropic position, and you may require a reversal of the surgery. So understand and explain the long-term possible outcomes is the only way you can actually convince the parents about the issues of operating early. And as you have raised the issue of refractive procedures prior to squint or accommodative esotropia, so would you consider or would you advise refractive procedures for correction of the refractive error in accommodative esotropias?
No, I would not advise. I mean, I have seen 2 cases with not very good outcomes. So, I mean, I would not advise them, because this child was just with a simple hyperopia and a pure accommodative esotropia getting corrected with glasses. LASIK done, landed up with an irregular astigmatism, and that was more difficult to correct. And now the cornea is so steep, and it is like we have kept on contact lenses. So it is, I do not think it is advisable.
Absolutely. Again, the major problems, long-term problems Dr. Suma has highlighted. The other important issue is that these are not in their final levels of refractive error. So you know that as the child will grow, the hyperopia is going to come down. So if you plan and operate for the hyperopia today, over time you are going to make the child a myopic child because you will correct the hyperopia for today. And if you undercorrect, then it is not really any benefit other than reducing the power of the glass that the child is wearing, because they would in any case require the glasses for the control of their esotropia. So while there is a fair amount of interest in refractive correction of accommodative esotropias, but truly speaking, as a long-term outcome, it is a very poor alternative to a good, high-quality, clear glass that can be used. So we'll move on to the next important point of discussion. Intermittent divergent squints, which, as Dr. Suma actually pointed out, are apparently easier, but truly more difficult to actually manage because of their problems of recurrences and overcorrection. So Dr. Ankur, who leads an independent strabismus and glaucoma practice in Jaipur, would highlight about managing a case of intermittent exotropia.
Am I audible?
Yes,
Yes,
Dr.
yes.
Ankur, your slides
Yes.
are visible.
Thank you, Professor Rohit, for making me a part, and thank you, AIOC, for giving me the opportunity. I'll be talking in brief about managing a case of intermittent exotropia. Intermittent exotropia is one of the most common forms of strabismus seen. It develops either because of defective development or inheritance of binocular single vision, or some problem with the medial rectus. It is important to rule out pseudoexotropia, the fundal colubomas and macular drag, which may mimic divergent squint, but they are actually not. Problems in IDS could be the progression from exophoria to exotropia, the binocular single vision, which is present, but the stereopsis may be compromised. There can be problems of asthenopia, diplopia, phobia, and cosmetic and psychological issues. So we all know that the exophoria have a tendency to progress to intermittent exotropia and then to the constant exotropia, but some may remain constant. The distance to acuity drops much before the nears, and it may not fully recover. The asthenopic symptoms may include headache, eye pain, blurring of vision, and occasionally micropsia. The bright light dazzles the retinae, and fusion is disrupted, causing diplopia, and this causes closure of one eye, or diplopia phobia. So sometimes the squint can be seen only in the group photographs, and it may be more obvious with physical stress or strain and tiredness. There could be psychological issues that the patient is aligned in the indoors, but many kinds of addresses are big gathering. Because of the stress, the eye deviates out. Duane classified the intermittent exotropia into four types. The basic intermittent exotropia is when the distance and the near deviation is nearly equal, or the difference is less than 10% diopters. Convergence insufficiency is when the near deviation is more by 15% diopters as compared to the distance deviation. Divergence excess is labeled when the distance deviation is more by a factor of 15% diopters as compared to near. And then we have simulated or pseudo divergence excess, which is actually a basic deviation presenting like divergence excess. So this is a little bit of modified classification from Burians, where a 10% diopter was used to delineate between these. And then the Kushners used this tenacious proximal fusion, which can act as binding factor for pseudo divergence excess or simulated divergence excess type of basic intermittent exotropia. Now, this is a table which compares all the three classifications, but I'm not going into detail. Then we have these Karlhein's phases where the exophoria gradually goes into exotropia. So in the phase 1, we have exophoria for distance, but also for near. These patients are asymptomatic and often undetected. Then we have got intermittent exotropia and ortho for near in the phase 2. These patients are symptomatic and they are good for treatment. And in the phase 3, we have exotropia for near, distance, and exophoria or intermittent exotropia for distance. Now, this is the place where binocular vision actually starts getting compromised, and they also need treatment. And in the phase 4, we have lack of binocular single vision, and then there is exotropia for distance and near both, and such patients are late for treatment in terms of intermittent divergence squint. Now, how do we approach a patient? We have to have a comprehensive eye exam, look for causes of amblyopia and poor vision because they are not associated with IDS. Check for the binocular single vision. We have Worth 4-dot test, which is almost available in all electronic charts. We can also test with Begolinis and Synaptophore. Stereo acuity measurement should be done for distance and near. TNOs, Randot, and Titmus fly test are easily available these days. Do a adequate myopic glasses correction unless it is intended to be given in the form of overcorrection. Mild to moderate hyperopic correction should be given to the patient because it gives you a clear vision and facilitates fusion. Assess the deviation and other associated abnormalities, which could be oblique overactions or DVTs and whatnot. Do a post-patch PBCT if there is a difference between the distance and the near deviation. And post-op diplopia test is important, at least in the private practice, where you can find out how many of the patients can actually have diplopia if you tend to overcorrect them. Now, when to operate? Now, there are certain subjective methods where we can think of operating. When there is a progression from Karl-Lounge stage 2 to stage 3, we know phase 4 is late. Falling or low stereo acuity, exotropia presented more than 50% of waking hours, and diplopia phobia. Now, these are some indications where the surgery has to be done. And for this, there was a Newcastle control score, which was kind of incorporated, which incorporates the control of strabismus at home, clinic control at near and distance, and each point has been given a score, and then they're totaled together. So when the NCS is less than 2, the exotropia is well controlled, and there's a high probability of having a stable course. When NCS is 3 to 6, a surgical option may be a better choice. When Newcastle score is more than 7, then probably we have reached to a Karl-Lounge stage 4, phase 4, where we can correct the deviation surgically, but the stereopsis may not be recovered fully. Now, surgical, there could be some non-surgical management also. We can give some convergence exercises. It is important to understand that the patient should be made aware of physiological diplopia, and they just convert the tropia to a phoria. They do not cure or change the basic deviation in case of intermittent divergent squint. You can plan overcorrecting myopia. It can work only in high AC by ratios. Prisms are not a good option to kind of manage intermittent exotropia. Now, this is a girl which is showing you a good control of deviation with glasses and a good nearly normal stereo acuity, hence glasses are prescribed to this girl. Now, choice of surgery depends upon the distance versus near deviation, the AC by A ratio, and the presence of lateral gaze concomitants. Now, there could be problems in accurate measurement of strabismus because it is affected by the fusional control, the alertness, the state of health, and convergence accommodation relationship. That is why we need a good refraction and a post-patch PBCT to control both the convergence accommodation and the fusional control of the patient. In younger children, there may be problems in good assessment of deviation, associated movement abnormalities, and also there are chances of amblyopia if we tend to overcorrect them. So we try to kind of identify which children we can operate and which children we cannot operate. In older children and adults, we can also plan for slight overcorrection by 5 to 10 prism diopters as there is a slow exodrift after the surgery. Now, for a basic intermittent divergent squint, plan for bilateral lateral rectus recession. For a convergence insufficiency, the teaching is planned for MR resection. For divergence excess, we can plan LR recessions. We should not be doing large LR recessions, especially in the presence of lateral gaze concomitants. Also, it is possible that we may induce lateral gaze concomitants when we plan to do a large LR recession. Now, this is the case of IDS. In the bottom photograph, you can see a line, but in the upper photograph, you can see there is a clear-cut divergent squint. And when we look in the left up gaze, we can see there is a clear-cut left inferior oblique overactions. So when we are planning surgeries in these patients, when we are tackling inferior oblique in the right eye, so then we can always do a right lateral rectus recession along with whatever we are planning in these cases. Now, this is another girl which is having a poor control even for near. Despite exertion, she is not able to control for near. She's almost out even for the near also. So we plan for surgery in this patient. We can always plan for RNR because it's a large angle exotropia. This is another case where we have intermittent divergent squints with DVD. So there's a small angle IDS, about 14 prism diopters, but a large DVD which can be seen on this video. We can see that the left eye is moving out as you place the Spielman's occluder, and the right eye goes out immediately as you place the Spielman's occluder here. So she's planned for LR recession by 5 millimeters and bilateral superior rectus recessions. And this is 7-week post-surgery. And this is video which is showing you the good control of IDS as well as the DVD in this patient. So here we see the eye is not moving out, although there can be slight movement which can be perceived, but you know, DVD can only be controlled, cannot be cured. This is another girl having a poor control and poor stereo acuity. Again, the child is planned for surgery. So in the end, a good case-based assessment is mandatory for a successful outcome. Thank you for your kind attention.
So thank you very much, Dr. Ankur. That was an excellent coverage of a very complicated and difficult topic. So key things that you mentioned about, one was the requirement of overcorrection. So Dr. Suma, where would you plan for an overcorrection of intermittent divergent squint, and would you do that?
Yes, in all children above the age of 4 years. I would not overcorrect less than 4 years, because I do not, because the small amount of ESO also would create suppression scotoma. So I would overcorrect in children above the age of 4 years, and then I do not overcorrect in adults. I feel that it's better slightly to keep them undercorrected, because even small amount of overcorrection sometimes makes them causes diplopia, and they're not very happy with it. I would undercorrect them and keep them in exercises. But definitely, I would overcorrect in about the age of 4 years, and maybe 16 to 18 years, I would still overcorrect around 6 to 8 prisms of ESO.
Okay, although I would be a little more conservative in overcorrecting after 7 to 8 years, because I would not want to risk them remaining as a constant ESO even after 4 or 5 years, because there would be the risk that they may continue to complain of diplopia. And of course, we know that there is a 5 to 6 prism drift that would happen in exotropes. And that is why overcorrecting is always advantageous, possibly, but it is fraught with a lot of tension for the surgeon, because the patient in the initial 1 month will always come back for complaining of diplopia. The downsides of undercorrecting is that you must then, as Dr. Suma says, follow up the patient and encourage binocularity, because there is always that chance that they may actually go back to that small central scotoma that they may have, and therefore may not actually be seeing binocularly most of the time, and also do not get picked up because the angle deviations are small. But of course, it is possible to manage them on a follow-up basis and examine for their improvement or change in stereoacuity. So those are key things. One of the things which Dr. Ankur also highlighted was the group of patients of intermittent divergent squint but a high AC by A ratio. Now, this is a group which, unless you are careful, many of us have actually burnt our fingers with them. And I had this child who was a very small child and was controlled for near, but for distance was easily breaking. We didn't realize that the control is actually accommodational and not fusional for near. And post-operatively, the child was aligned for distance, but had an overcorrection or an esotropia for near. And the mother was extremely furious, because we started prescribing her bifocals for near. And she was like, he was occasionally squinting for distance and never required glasses. And now you have made the child always squinting for near and are advising him to wear glasses. So that was really the biggest, Waterloo we realized. So always when you have a distance near deviation difference, you must know why it is there. Is it fusional because of the tenacious proximal fusion, or is it accommodational because of the accommodational component for near, which will be easily visible if you do a proper workup and you do a patch test for distance and near when you're working up for deviation measurements, and following the patch test, if the distance near deviation difference remains, do a +3 for near. So that will help you to pick up an accommodational component or a high AC by ratio for near. So that's the other important thing that we need to be aware about. I will
In a small
yes.
child, like coming with around 2 or 3 years of age and having a high AC ratio, I think one advantage is we could prescribe them over minus lenses and use it to our advantage. Like I've seen patients getting controlled where if their near control is very good and the distance is less, so then you can give them over minus lenses. Of course, there are recent papers which say that it reduces myopia, but I have, in my experience, I have not found. I've weaned them off after 4 to 5 years and operate if they are not controlled. But I think you could.
So as Dr. Suma points out, over minus glasses or slightly under correction of hyperopic glasses is a good way of managing intermittent divergent squints. One of the important, in fact, where I feel the important intervention this comes when the child is being prescribed glasses for the very first time. So first you give them their appropriate correction, especially if they are hyperopic, so that you stimulate the the fusional mechanism. They have never seen a clear image, and that's why they were diverging frequently. You give them clear glasses, and then you slightly undercorrect the hyperopia or overcorrect the myopia, so that you can stimulate them to accommodate. Because amblyopes, children with poor vision who have never used their glasses, are ones who are notoriously known to have poor accommodational reserve. So you need to give them that stimulus for accommodation, and then plan a slight undercorrection of their hyperopia or a slight overcorrection of their myopia, so that they become controlled. As Dr. Suma points out, a recent paper has actually talked about a risk of myopia developing in them because of the hyperopic stimulus in the mid and peripheral retina. But I would still say that a good fusional control is probably something that we are more worried about in the immediate term, and maybe over time, within a bit of time, we probably operate them. So maybe that risk of myopia can be temporized or be done away with. But yes, it's a good alternative, and definitely can be planned in a very small child where you are kind of wary to intervene and not, I mean, the basic risk is creating an overcorrection and causing esotropia, which can be very bad for binocularity. So
lot of children actually have a large cylinder or maybe a moderate hyperopia. Now, these children should be given glasses first, and most of them actually start fusing once you give them glasses. So, just by seeing the patient jumping to surgery and announcing that this patient would need a surgery would sometimes, deter away from the follow-ups.
Exactly the point that we started divergent squint discussion with. They are the most difficult to manage, because not only are you dealing with a motor strabismus, you're dealing with a possible subnormal sensory mechanism. So interventions have to be in both directions. Maybe if the sensory system is not that good controlling it, if just by stimulating that, as been mentioned about good glasses, they help us to correct the intermittent divergent squint and make them into phoria phromotropia. So interventions have to be in both directions, manage the motor deviation as well as the sensory issues that these children often have. And earlier, when we used to think DVDs only exist in patients who have early onset strabismus, we realize, as Dr. Ankur also showed us, intermittent divergent squints, if you carefully evaluate them, a large number of them may actually have DVD, showing that they probably have an early onset sensory problem that is manifesting as an intermittent divergent squint rather than the reverse, that they have a squint which is manifesting with deteriorating stereoacuity. So these are very key discussion points, and I think all of us learn as we go along, manage these cases. So I'll quickly move on to paralytic strabismus, basic workup of paralytic strabismus, and then we'll take nystagmus, and then if there is any time left, we will discuss some of the management of difficult cases. So yes, so I'll be talking about incomitant strabismus. All that we have talked about actually comes up in this broad chart that we can see. Strabismus can be pseudo, latent, which is occasionally there, and of course manifest to latent intermittent squints and latent esotropia, as we've talked about. Manifest squints can be comitant. We've discussed the common eso and exotropes. We discussed the incomitant strabismus that can be paralytic and restrictive and very rarely strabismic, spastic. Paralytic strabismus is basically due to underaction of a muscle, which could be neurogenic or myogenic in origin, and restrictive is because of inability of the eye to move in a particular direction because opposing forces or something that is stopping the eye from moving in that direction. Clinical characteristics for both would be incomitance or limitation of movement. So they call it incomitant because the eyes do not move together. Comitant moves together. They are commies and both eyes move together in a direction. Incomitant, the eyes don't move together in a direction. So in one direction, there will be minimal or no strabismus. And as the eyes move in the other direction, the deviation starts increasing. They manifest with diplopia. And like you can see in this case, in a third nerve, you can see the limitation of movement very clearly there. In this case of a left sixth nerve, you can see abduction deficits. It's important in any patient of incomitant strabismus to do a detailed systemic workup. And if it's acquired paralytic, you need to do a complete workup for possible etiology. Besides ocular examination and fundus examination, visual fields are essential in case you suspect there is a space occupying lesion, because sixth nerve palsies could be a sign or a false localizing sign of a raised intracranial pressure due to any cause, including IIH or tumors, which are essential to be picked up in the very time you see the child. Head postures are very commonly seen in incompetence strabismus because the patient may try to motor correct for the diplopia that he or she may have, and very rarely they may actually do have a head posture to increase the deviation so that the disturbing image falls in the far periphery and becomes easier to ignore. It's always important to look for ocular motility and saccadic velocities. You need to do both versions and duction. So in this case, you could see this child was actually cross-fixating and not abducting because he was fixing with the other eye in the opposite gazes. But the moment you do adduction, you realize that there is no limitation of movement, and it is just because of a cross-fixating eye. The other important thing you look for is aberrant innervation or aberrant regeneration. It is commonly seen in congenital cases, in traumatic cases, and tumors. So it's important to remember that if you see aberrant innervation or aberrant regeneration in an acquired non-traumatic case, always rule out tumors. It's tumors unless proved otherwise. So it's important, like in this case, you can see it also helps us in decision making and managing. So this was a case, you can see that besides when the eye adapts, you can see the lid retraction. So there are misfired fibers from the medial rectus going to the LPS, causing the aberrant innervation. You need to measure deviation in primary and secondary because unlike a comitant squint, primary deviation and secondary deviations are different, with secondary deviations being more because secondary deviations are those which are deviations when the peritic or the abnormal eye fixates, and primary deviations are when the normal eye fixates. So when you force fix the peritic eye, the fixing eye of the normal eye would have a greater innervation, and therefore the normal eye will show a much larger deviation. So secondary deviations will always be more than primary deviations in a comitant squint. So if you even think it's a comitant squint and you have a difference of either eye fixing, so always in every squint, measure the deviation with either eye squinting. You may be able to pick up a partially resolved peritic squint, which you think is actually a comitant squint or a late onset presentation of a comitant squint. Diplopia charting and pattern of the diplopia helps us to understand the way or the cause of the strabismus or the deviation. And you need to do, of course, do first whether it's a diplopia is uniocular or binocular, you need to fix the area of single binocular vision. You see where the distance between the images is maximum, and very important, use a slit source for measuring diplopia because you need to identify whether the images are inclined or straight. The moment the images are inclined or the patient complains of even slight inclined or torsional diplopia, you're considering cyclovertical muscles as the cause. So this is the way a patient of sixth nerve will present with diplopia maximum in the direction where the muscle is underacting. Hess or Lee charts can be used to demonstrate the deviation. It helps in understanding strabismus, peritic strabismus, which is not easy to understand, and also in follow-up. So this is the way a sixth nerve palsy. So this is a right sixth nerve palsy. You can see the smaller squares is where the paresis is, and a corresponding overaction or a secondary deviations that can be seen in the left eye. Similarly, you can see a left superior oblique underaction here. So the left superior oblique is underacting. Correspondingly, the right inferior rectus is showing an overaction. When the left eye is fixed, the right eye will show a corresponding overaction. Restriction versus paresis, it's important that the restriction of movement should be picked, whether there is any true restriction or it's a paresis. For that, you need to do a forced duction test, and the forced duction test is possible under topical anesthesia in older children or general anesthesia in younger children. So you hold the limbus at the opposite end, ask the patient to look in that direction, and then lift the eye for recti, press the eye for obliques, and you rotate it in that direction. Like in this case, the eye can be moved or rotated laterally, which was not possible when the patient was voluntarily asked to move. So in this forced duction, you can see it is free and there is no restriction of the medial rectus, and there is a paresis of the lateral rectus. Now you need to do an active force generation test in case the force duction test is tight. If the FDT is free, there is no need to actually do really an active force generation test, because if the muscle was actually active, the eye would have rolled spontaneously and normally during voluntary movement. But if the medial rectus is tight and you do not know how much force there is in the lateral rectus, you need to ask you hold the limbus, then you ask the patient to look into the direction of the muscle, which was peritic, and then you feel for the tug. If you can feel a tug, there is an active force in that eye, and your surgery planning accordingly gets modified. You measure torsional changes by subjective or objective means. You do a double Maddox rod, synaptophore, and scotometry in subjective, and you can just do an indirect or a fundus photograph to see for true torsional changes. So here you can see the torsional change. This is the line at which between the lower third the fovea should be, and you can clearly see bilaterally the fovea is much lower than the normal range. So you can pick up torsion by fundus photographs and see for change. Rule out neuroimaging is required in an early peritic squint or a peritic squint which is young, pupillary involvement in a third nerve, aberrant regeneration without trauma, non-resolving or progressive, or if other neurological cases or things are involved. So we'll stop here for incomitant squint, and I would continue and talk about nystagmus, and finally we'll take discussions as in the end. I'll just open the nystagmus and then we'll probably take discussions in the end. Any comments in the meantime as I load anybody, please?
Very nice presentation about incomitant strabismus, Dr. Rohit. It was so comprehensive, and it could not be covered in such a short time, because it covers so many topics. But the basics have been very nicely covered, like what tests have to be appropriately done for all cases of incomitant strabismus, and that is very nice. We need to do diplopia charting, we need to do Hess charting, we need to do FTT. All these tests must be done before in all cases of strabismus. We can't say we don't have time to do these tests. We need to do these tests and then only plan surgery. In fact, I would say all 9 gazes also should be measured in all cases of incomitant strabismus, because that only helps in planning the surgery. Otherwise, if you just measure in one gaze, you do not, in primary position, you're not able to completely gauge what surgery or which muscle you want to touch, especially in incomitant strabismus. Any points, Dr. Ankur, you want to add?
No, I think you have well covered, ma'am. I just want to add regarding the first talk of Digvijay that, we can keep a small box of toffee, which can help us lure children come again and again. So I remember a few children, they do still come and they demand toffee at the outset only.
Yeah.
That's so true.
So, I mean,
Digvijay had shown a packet of Alpenliebe there. So, although in these COVID times, parents may become rather apprehensive about the child acquiring infection, but yes, under normal circumstances, there should be something the child look forwards to when he comes to your OPD. So
I think we can move forward for the next year.
I'll just move on so that we can. Yeah, I'll talk about nystagmus and then we'll probably discuss everything in the end, whatever is remaining. So my slide is visible.
But not in slideshow.
Yeah, we can see in this. Yeah.
My slides are visible?
Yeah.
No. Yes, sir.
It's not full screen? Okay. I'll just do it again.
It is full screen.
So, yes. Okay, I go ahead?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So we'll quickly try and cover a very, very complicated topic of nystagmus. And whenever you come across a child presenting with ocular oscillations, my first question would be, is it nystagmus? Because you need to differentiate it from many other disorders like periodic horizontal deviation, saccades, even eye bobbing or nystagmoid movements, what we call. So our first understanding of nystagmus is that it's a rhythmic, involuntary to and fro movement of the eyes. And all components of this should be true before you call it a nystagmus. Involuntary, rhythmic, and complete to and fro. So nystagmus, once you diagnose or you say it's nystagmus, your next question comes, is it physiological or it's pathological? Physiological nystagmus would be endpoint nystagmus, which is not uncommon to see, vestibular, optokinetic, and sometimes very smart children present with voluntary nystagmus. So the endpoint or most physiological nystagmus usually will present in extremes of gaze. The primary trajectory is horizontal. They are not sustained for too long. They kind of dampen out after a few beats. They're low amplitude and symmetric, as is that they have the same amplitude and waveform in both the eyes. And of course, there is no other pathological neuro-ophthalmological sign is present. So pathological nystagmus is, of course, anything that is not physiological. We tend to understand in the way that it is possibly due to vision loss or a motor nystagmus where an integrator function is abnormal, or else a vestibular nystagmus, although CMAS actually has not defined them as sensory and motor, but we continue to use it because it helps us to manage these patients. The moment you say it's pathological, my question comes whether it's acquired or congenital. And it's very, very important to differentiate acquired from congenital nystagmus, because you need to get a detailed evaluation for acquired. And key features would be a recent onset or a later age of presentation. Patient will complain of oscillopsia, that the images shimmer or move. Some patients of infantile or congenital nystagmus actually complain of shimmering of the image, but that is not very uncomfortable for them, and they just notice the image occasionally, but it's not something that stops them from functioning. And of course, associated neurological symptoms in acquired. So the moment you have an acquired nystagmus, discuss with neurologist, manage with neurologist. Our discussions essentially are congenital or infantile nystagmus. Like I said, we kind of say there are sensory or motor. So sensory nystagmus is an association with poor vision primarily, and because of poor vision, they do not have a good fixation fusion mechanism that results in the nystagmus like you see in children with bilateral congenital cataract. And motor nystagmus essentially in which they have a good visual acuity. However, because of the nystagmus, it may not be absolutely normal, and you see certain very classical features like head postures in them. So pathological nystagmus in infancy is essentially three types, although there are many, but from an ophthalmologist point of view, we're looking at three very important ones. Infantile nystagmus syndrome, which was earlier called the congenital nystagmus, fusion maldevelopment syndrome, which was also called the latent or the latent manifest nystagmus, and spasmus nutans syndrome. So infantile nystagmus syndrome is a binocular uniplanar nystagmus, which is abolished in sleep, dampened by convergence, and a fact that we tend to use for management. It increases on a fixation effort. So a patient tries to be anxiously look better or clearer, actually increases the nystagmus. And an important waveform is an ascending slow phase, which we'll talk about later. Latent manifest, on the other hand, is congenital or infantile, has a jerk and a fast phase towards the fixing eye. So that is a key thing in them. When you cover, you can see the fixing eye, the direction of beat is towards the fixing eye. And that is very, very important to differentiate them from infantile nystagmus syndrome. The key importance of identifying a fusion maldevelopment is that there is no need for imaging in these, and it's because of a fusional maldevelopment that is responsible for the nystagmus. Spasmus nutans we see in very small children presenting by 6 to 8 months, and they have a head nodding, a head posture, and a nystagmus that is not symmetrical in both the eyes. So the velocity or the amplitude may be different in both the eyes, and it's very important to neuroimage these children because it can be associated with chiasmal gliomas. Usually they are benign and would tend to settle off, but some may be associated with a chiasmal glioma, so you need to investigate these patients. Who do you neuroimage? All acquired strabismus, periodic alternating nystagmus, seesaw nystagmus, spasmus nutans, and any nystagmus patient with subnormal vision. So who's having subnormal vision, disc pallor, unless you're able to identify a retinal cause, you need to rule out a neurological cause. You need to measure a head posture and measure the head posture with a visually demanding task. Like this girl does not come with a head posture, but as the demanding task increases, she reads down the Snellen's chart, you can see that the child's head posture starts manifesting, and it's actually a very severe head posture which needed correction. You can measure head postures and nystagmus by video nystagmography or electronystagmography. So these are waveforms you can actually measure. You can see this is primary gaze, and you can see the waveforms decrease in left gaze. So patient looking left, the nystagmus is minimum, and there is no change with either eye occlusion. So there is no latent component to it. And again, this is the waveform with the face turn the child likes to. So we can actually measure now and see what is the angle at which the waveform is minimum. Management is to stabilize, to improve visual acuity, decrease the nystagmus, and if there is a head posture, move that to the primary position. Non-surgical interventions are aimed at improving vision, and optical glasses are the single most important intervention you can do. So age-appropriate cycloplegic refraction give the best corrected visual acuity that itself dampens the nystagmus tremendously, and if required, low vision assistance in these patients. If one eye is amblyopic, give amblyopia therapy. Even occlusion is not absolutely contraindicated, because initially, while even in the latent component may start manifesting, but as the vision improves, the latent component dampens, and you can actually improve the vision in the amblyopic eye also. There are options of medical management, as we would see, but as we discussed, optical correction is the single most powerful therapeutic intervention you can do. Over minus lenses here in infantile nystagmus is also possible. Like we talked about, their accommodation actually decreasing the nystagmus. Amblyopia therapy extremely essential. You can dampen the latent component or dampen the manifest component and make it latent. Prisms can be used, base out prisms to stimulate convergence, or preoperatively measure the head posture so that you can check the amount of intervention you need to do. There are alternative therapies like auditory biofeedback and acupuncture. This was a thesis we had done at our center, but unfortunately, this is not long lasting. Similarly, botulinum toxin is possible for acquired nystagmus, but not beneficial for infantile nystagmus syndrome. Medical management has been overall disappointing. We've seen brinzolamide have some effect in infantile nystagmus syndrome in patients who do not have a face turn, but other than surgery for face turn, there is nothing as impactful as surgery. So our treatment options include inducing adduction or convergence, shifting the null position to primary position, and to reduce the amplitude of nystagmus. So face turn surgeries, a lot of surgeries have been described. We prefer the augmented Anderson's, in which we operate on the yoke muscles and do a supramaximal recession of the yoke. So you do the medial rectus in the 9 millimeters in the eye in the direction of face turn, and 12 millimeter lateral rectus in the contralateral eye. In this way, we shift the face turn or the null point from that gaze to the primary position. And advantages are that you're only doing recessions, you can reverse the recessions, and just in case you've operated on a pan, you can convert it to an all-four recti recession so that you can correct it. This was the kind of face turn we operated. So do the lateral rectus here and the medial rectus here to get a head posture correction. You can even see on the electronystagmography how this improves. So this was primary gaze, and this is the after surgery correction of null position. Dampening of the nystagmus can be done by supramaximal recessions or the Hertel-Delosso procedure. Supramaximal, you do 12 mm recession of both lateral recti and 9 mm recessions of both medial recti, and this places them retroequatorially. And although this has a risk of consecutive exo, but is definitely useful, at least in the initial period. And the alternative is the Hertel-Delosso procedure, where they just disinsert, do a tenotomy, and then reattach the muscle. And this has been found to be fairly effective, but again, both of them tend to come back over time. So I'll just stop share, and maybe we can discuss on the issues that we have managed. So any comments from anybody else in the panel, and we can take up some questions otherwise.
I think so, you nicely covered. The only thing we can manage in the practice for nystagmus, in fact, nystagmus is face turn actually, to be very frank, in the long run. So that's what we can think of in a nutshell.
Truly,
actually.
Surgically, I think face turn,
surgically,
and that is very, very impactful. Patients are very happy after face turn surgery. Whatever is your surgery of choice, Kastenbaum's, modified augmented Anderson's, whatever is your surgery of choice, face turn surgery is pretty effective. Without face turn, most surgeries to dampen the nystagmus have not been very effective.
Very effective, yeah.
Even the bimedial recessions to induce convergence has not been very successful, and that has the risk of creating an exotropia, and the patient actually may start complaining of diplopia post-operatively. So surgical interventions have been disappointing. We've always been looking out for some magical medical portion intervention. Deloso has mentioned some very interesting molecule which they are working on, and we hope we'll get that. But Dr. Suma, any comments on this or any previous points that
yes, I think as both of you said, the main thing is correction of the face turn. And I think the face turn results are very happy. Patients are very happy when you do the face turn. And I think you should not operate also if the face turn is very less, because there's no, because the parents are not then really happy to see the significance of the improvement. Only if the face turn is more than 20 degrees or 15, more than 15, 20 degrees, then only I plan surgery. Otherwise, I tell them that this face turn is what we actually get after surgery, a small amount of face turn. So it is better to, unless we find that the surgery is really going to improve by 2 lines with the face turn corrected, then I would touch it. Yeah.
Significant visual difference, visual acuity difference with face turn surgery becomes an indication. A small face turn probably managed. The other important thing for nystagmus surgery is for face turn is that wait for 4 to 5 years at least, so that you can actually measure the true face turn. Also, we've seen that over time, some of the face turn and some of the nystagmus actually tends to come down. So do not intervene very early. The only indication of intervening early for nystagmus would be if it is associated with the strabismus, particularly esotropia. So if you have, say, a Ciancia syndrome or an adduction, a null in adduction, so that would be an indication for intervention where you could plan an early surgery. So that would probably be the only indication where I would prefer to go less than 5 years. Otherwise, as the child starts going to school, looking at the distance, starts reading, you actually are able to get the true and actual face turn that the child has. And I think Dr. Suma, one point that she raised was the acute acquired concomitant esotropia. And I think we should, just before we close, discuss this issue, because I think it's becoming a major issue, and all of us have started seeing a much larger incidence of this disorder without any neurological or accommodative component. So maybe the COVID epidemic has actually increased, because we used to see barely 1 or 2 cases in 6 months, 3 or 6 months, barely one, maybe 1 in a year or 2 in a year. And now, I mean, I think all of us have seen, a large number of cases already in the COVID lockdown. Dr. Suma.
Yes, I think we have seen an increased amount of acute acquired concomitant esotropia coming to the clinic. And most of these children have diplopia, and they are having also associated vertigo. And it is very disconcerting for the parents. So we need to, most of them are either psychological. We have found some of them have been mostly psychological. MRI is normal. And, or because of excessive use of digital devices.
Absolutely. So basic concept behind that possibly could be that prolonged near work has overstrained that fusional mechanism, and the phoria then becomes a tropia, because almost all, I haven't seen any child, they are not accommodative in origin. And as you said, from a knee-jerk reflex, I at the moment get all of these imaged. There is no way that we would want to take a risk there. But and over time, we've had to operate some of them. So I think that's a key thing. The key thing to inform, of course, parents is try to take breaks between long hours of near work, tab, and related activity.
Yeah, we should more and more stress on avoid near work to reduce so much of online classes going on for children. And it is like from morning to evening now they are on the computers. So one of the hassles is of course the increase in myopia, and secondly also increase in strabismus, like acute concomitant esotropias. So parents counseling, and I think more and more we should educate the general public that we should how to reduce the online classes at the time.
So that's something very difficult to answer. Jeenal is now repeatedly looking at us, telling us that our time is over. So before she closes us down, Swati, if you could come, we could take a snapshot. Digvijay or Ankur, we could take a snapshot so that we could have Swati. And thank you to my co-instructors who have made it a very interesting basic course. And it was an absolute pleasure to interact. And I hope that our next EIOS is physical, so that that added touch of interacting physically is what is missing. And thank you very much. Thank you, AIOS, for giving us the opportunity. Has anybody taken a screenshot?
I have, sir.
Great.
Okay.
So thank you very much. Smiling faces, and thank you, Jinal, for helping us conduct this. Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye.
Stay safe.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to have this session in this hall. And thank you so much, especially to you, to make sure that each speaker finishes their session in time, their presentation in time. Thank you for coordinating.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.